A new study has found that immunity acquired from a COVID infection is on par with the protection provided through 2 doses of an mRNA vaccine. Infection-acquired immunity cut the risk of hospitalization and death from a COVID reinfection by 88% for at least 10 months, the Lancet study found.
The immunity generated from an infection was found to be at least as high, if not higher than that provided by 2 doses of an mRNA vaccine, the authors wrote. Senior study author Christopher Murray said, "This is really good news in the sense that protection against severe disease and death after infection is really quite sustained at 10 months. NBC News writes. Yeah, that's an incredible study, especially the part about the longevity. Because think of the concern a lot of people had with both the protection from prior infection and protection from the vaccines is, well, how long does this last? Because that's the fundamental question you're having to consider when thinking about whether or not it's time to boost, whether you want to.
And does it wane more easily or more rapidly for people who are immunocompromised or the elderly, the people we want, to be protected anyway? Yeah, I saw a lot of people talking about this online with a certain amount of well-deserved smug satisfaction because people have been saying for a long time that it seemed likely there would be some good level of protection after an infection, and the Faucis of the world they've admitted it by now, but they really did slow walk that one.
Yeah.
It took a long time to say that there was so much downplaying of it, so much dismissing of it. That was really harmful. There was it doesn't really matter if if you've already had it, you still got to get vaccinated. Which now we know that should be considered, if you've had it, that should be considered like 1 or maybe even 2 shots or something.
And the implications, of course, as we've discussed, for the people who lost their jobs because there were vaccine mandates.
Absolutely.
The athletes that weren't able to travel to the country because there's vaccine mandates. It's incredible. And not to mention the level of course, social shaming that existed around the idea that you're going to kill somebody's grandma because you don't go ahead and get vaccinated. I think that a lot of people really did believe that in good faith. Take that for what you will, because there was such a lack of clarity in the media sphere. I just had a conversation with someone on my podcast actually earlier this month who seemed to just not really know what the new science had said. And because I think so many of the voices that were leading on this were not necessarily voices that were trusted among liberals or even among certain parts of the left, they were acting in ignorance and frankly behaving in a way that was judgmental, that was ultimately damaging to our understanding of the science and our ability to communicate it across different political camps.
And it would have affected the messaging because particularly with the subsequent variants, COVID becoming extremely infectious, it becoming harder and harder to avoid it entirely, even if you're taking extreme precautions. The messaging could have been like, well, have you had it yet? Okay, if you haven't had it yet and you're in a 65 plus category, look, you should get the vaccine to decrease your risk of severe disease and death when you then get COVID. If you've already had COVID, great. This is not, make whatever choice you want, but it's not as pivotal. But if you've not had it, you should plan on, it's hard to avoid. You have a high likelihood of getting it, and you might benefit, especially if you're in that age category, from vaccination first. But if you've already had, there'll be more trust if the experts were saying, look, the key is, do you have any kind of protection yet to COVID? Find out, oh, you do. Okay, well then this is less of a dire situation then, because you have some protection. And I think if you'd leveled with people on that, it could have been really helpful for the campaign to actually encourage vaccination in the at-risk population. Absolutely.
And I do hope they continue. I mean, I'm sure they are, but they continue to do these studies about how long the protective effects of these things last. When I was talking to people like Vijay Prasad about the decision making around the booster shots, which had just come out at the time, and the decision making that people were going through, I took a lot of what he said to heart. But the question for me was, okay, but at some point we can all acknowledge that this is probably, the protection is going to taper off, whether it's from a vaccine or from a prior infection. And you can't completely ignore the relevance of boosters as long as that's the case. And are we going to be able to tell when it wears off before we have some huge wave of folks who are getting reinfected and then going into the hospital because they no longer have that infection? Or is there a way to predict that beforehand and to evade the enormous burden that would put on both the healthcare infrastructure and on obviously the people who are going to get sick and suffer. And I think that's the real unknown here that I hope scientists are getting to the bottom of.
Yeah, and it should, if there's ever, we go through this again, God forbidding, hopefully not, there should be a little bit more humility from the medical establishment to begin with, on all fronts, right? There was, well, we don't know about this, but then confident assertions. I mean, there was confident assertions about how the vaccines would drastically reduce cases as well. They look at the studies; they're really effective against that, and you know that came apart.
Yeah, and look, it is also worth noting that there were some bold claims that were made about the kinds of things that would prevent COVID that were not vaccine related. Some of which were not validated by science.
Yep,
some of which had some validation that was minor and not really substantial. So there have been mistakes made across kind of the political spectrum.
There's a lot of wishful thinking about exactly.
And I'm not equating what some online person says about what treatment might be good versus what the CDC told us and misled us for a long time at all. But, you know, there is like a kind of a fog of war, confusion, some of which is in good faith. And I hope that we're able to figure out a way to regain trust and to not just be pointing fingers, because conflicts tragedies like this, emergencies like this are not going to go away, and even COVID isn't going to go away.
People who credibly ran with all of that stuff could have used the application of an extra dose of skepticism, the skepticism they applied to the mainstream, the vaccines, et cetera. They could use a dose of skepticism in that direction, and people who put utter blind faith in what the medical establishment recommended, but confidently asserted that all the other stuff was that's obvious fraud, should apply some skepticism the other way. We'd all benefit from a little bit of a...
Are you intentionally framing it as a dose because you're in this pharmaceutical mindset?
Yes,
a double injection of some skepticism.
Yes, just like how I said that Buttigieg's career has been derailed when we're talking about
very nice.
We're using literary references.
Love the wordplay, Robby, today.
More Rising right after this. Stay tuned.